Thanks to Wex for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs and this is my review of the Canon PowerShot V1, a fixed lens compact camera with a large sensor aimed at video creators. Following my initial news pieces, I've now spent some quality hands-on time with the V1 and I've got loads of results for you in this video. It'll also take 22 megapixel photos and I'll show you how they look, but as you'll learn, many of the design, feature and control decisions are aimed at video users first. After all, the V in the name stands for video, so don't expect a photo-oriented camera here. Officially launched worldwide in March 2025 alongside the EOS R50V, the PowerShot V1 will cost around £960, dollar price in description. Coincidentally, that's roughly the same price as the R50V with its new 14 to 30mm kit zoom, so Canon's essentially giving you the choice of a fixed lens compact versus an interchangeable lens model with a larger APS-C sensor, although as you'll discover there are more differences to weigh up. I've also got a separate video about the R50V if you're interested in that model. So Canon's V series has gone from just the original V10 to 3 models, all aimed at video creators but with different feature sets. As such, I wouldn't be surprised to see further V-series products in the future, and in this respect, it's looking similar to Sony's ZV series. In terms of price and features, the V1 is positioned above the popular G7X Mark III from 2019. Now, the G7X III officially remains on sale, although low supply coupled with high demand for all the G-series compacts ironically means that the new V1 could actually work out cheaper compared to the scalpers on eBay. Let's hope that Canon can make enough of them and put an end to ridiculous opportunists. So say we all. Just before delving in, UK viewers can order the PowerShot V1, the EOS R50V, or indeed the new RF 20mm 1.4 VCM launched alongside them from Wex. Their expert impartial advice is available online, on the phone, and in store to help you find exactly what you need. Starting 28th of March, Wex stores will also be hosting dedicated days to get your hands on the PowerShot V1 so you can try it out in person. They have 15 stores around the UK staffed by camera enthusiasts who can help you make the right choice. Check the link in the description for further details. Right, now back to the review. Measuring 118 by 68 by 53mm and weighing 426 grams including battery, the V1 is chunkier all round compared to the G7X Mark III, but it should still squeeze into larger pockets and it's just fine carried around in a bag. As far as I know, the V1 is not weather sealed. Viewed from the front, the V1 is styled like the G7X, but with a taller grip that should fit 3 fingers with your index hovering above the shutter button. When powered up, the lens covering opens with the barrel quickly extending by about 30mm, and it has the camera ready for action in about 1.5 seconds. Powering back down again is equally quick, making it feel much more responsive than some earlier compact cameras. Also note the free spinning, customizable control ring around the lens barrel. Turning to the top surface, you'll note unlike the G7X, there's no pop-up flash, while the multifunction shoe in the middle lacks the pins for traditional flash guns. I think there are shoe adapters for flashes, but this is one of the many indicators that the V1 is aimed more for video than hybrid or photo use. This shoe is meant for more video-based accessories like microphones. To the right is the built-in microphone, and Canon considerately includes a muffler accessory in the box that slides onto the shoe and protects it from wind. It's similar to an approach previously offered by Sony, and as you'll hear in my demos later, it can be pretty effective. The camera is powered up for shooting using a small button towards the front, while the color switch around the mode dial sets it to record either photos or videos. Meanwhile, the spring-loaded collar around the shutter button operates the motorized zoom lens, and there's a dedicated button for video to its right. Note the small mode dial with the usual exposure, custom, scene and effect positions. Oh, and you can also power up the camera directly into playback by holding down the play button. Round the back, the V1 is dominated by a 3-inch screen with 1.04 million dots. Now this doesn't sound particularly detailed, but it does look bright and crisp in use, and that's a good thing too, as in the absence of a viewfinder, it is the only means of composition on this camera. Now I realise this is a video oriented camera, I keep saying it and keep getting told the target audience doesn't use viewfinders, but personally speaking I still find them invaluable even when setting up or reviewing videos. It is what it is though, but I do wish Canon would make an EVF accessory for the multi-interface shoe, or even better offer a photo oriented version of the V1 in the future. Come on, who's with me? As you'd expect, the screen is side hinged, flipping out and twisting up or down to face you for easier composition at high or low angles, or back on itself for protection. Turning to the left side, you'd expect to find the ports, but instead there's a vent. This draws air into the V1 using a fan for active cooling, with warm air exiting through the smaller vents above this and on the upper left hand side of the rear. This system effectively takes the place of a pop-up flash or a viewfinder would have occupied on a previous model. The fan can be set to auto, off or manual at a choice of 3 speeds. These can be used to extend recording times and in my tests were barely audible. That said, battery power actually proved to be the limiting factor for me, with my V1 consuming a full charge after 78 minutes of 4K 25p and with the fan set to auto. It can also run on USB power delivery, but subsequent heat generation may actually reduce the recording time. More testing is required, especially if using the camera for streaming. Meanwhile, the ports can be found on the right hand grip side of the camera, with 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks behind their own rubber flaps, followed by USB-C and micro HDMI sharing a larger flap below. The USB-C port runs at USB 2 speeds and allows the V1 to be used as a webcam for streaming, albeit only in 1080 resolution. This should at least avoid or reduce overheating, but again, more tests are required. Underneath the camera is a tripod thread and the compartment for the battery and a single SD card slot. The V1 is powered by the LP E17 pack, which again gave me about 78 minutes of 4K video recording. Moving on to the sensor, the V1 employs what is known as a 1.4 type sensor. That's roughly similar in height to Micro Four Thirds, but wider. That gives it roughly twice the area of the 1-inch type sensors found in models like the V10, G7X and Sony ZV-1, so you should have less noise and higher dynamic range given the same ISO values. To see how the V1 looks throughout its standard sensitivity range, I photographed this still life at each of the ISO values, starting at 100 ISO here. Now these are all JPEGs out of camera, but I'll try a raw comparison later when it's fully supported, and I've also got a video noise test later in the review. Next for the camera at 200 ISO. And now at 400 ISO, where there's a fractional loss in detail. There's a little bit more lost at 800 ISO. And now here's how it looks at 1600 ISO. Meanwhile at 3200 ISO, the noise reduction has smeared out a lot of the finest detail, and at 6400 ISO upwards, the V1 allows increasing amounts of noise to become visible. Certainly those top sensitivities should only be for emergency use. And remember, if you're comparing this to other cameras, their lens apertures will also impact what ISOs can be used under the same conditions. The V1 may have a larger sensor area than the G7X, but its lens is just over a stop dimmer at each end of those ranges. The maximum photo resolution is 22 megapixels, and you can record them as compressed JPEG or HIF files, with or without a RAW version if you like. There's also 3 lower resolutions and more compressed options for JPEGs and HIFs, as well as the option for compressed C-RAW files. In the aspect ratio menu, you'll see the native 3:2 shape, as well as cropped 1:1, 4:3 and 16:9, as well as a 1.4 times crop mode. Now this is to effectively extend the range of the lens to become a more photo-friendly 23 to 71mm equivalent, albeit also reducing the resolution to 10.8 megapixels. The fastest shutter speeds are 2,000th of a second with the mechanical leaf shutter, or 16,000th of a second with the electronic shutter, and while a menu lets you choose between these types, there's no auto mode to switch, say, to electronic when you need above 2,000th of a second. If you're into burst shooting, the V1's max speed is 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, or 30 with the electronic, and slower speeds are also available. Let's now take a closer look at the lens, a 3.1 times optical range equivalent to 16 to 50mm, with a maximum aperture of f2.8 to 4.5. Compare that to the G7X Mark III with its 24 to 100 equivalent range and f1.8 to 2.8 aperture. Both cameras have built-in 3-stop ND filters enabled from a menu, which are invaluable for video but also handy for long exposure photos. And both lenses also have optical image stabilization, with the V1's lens claiming 5 stops in the middle. Clearly the V1's range is widened more to the needs of videographers, especially vloggers filming handheld or at close range, although there's also plenty of drama in ultra-wide photos too. Do note that the aperture is just over a stop dimmer than the G7X3 at both ends of the range though, requiring higher ISOs under the same conditions. So let's have a look at the lens quality, starting with my distant landscape view of Brighton Pier angled so that details run into the corners. No, I'm not drunk. You're looking at the V1 at 16mm 2.8 here, the widest coverage with the maximum aperture, where the details look nice and crisp in the middle with no need to stop down any further. Moving into the far corner shows the details remain nice and sharp even at the maximum aperture, which is impressive given this wide coverage. There's also no benefit in sharpness when stopping down in this test. Now for the longer end of the range at 50mm f4.5, the maximum aperture at this focal length. Taking a closer look in the middle shows decent detail, although stopping it down to f5.6 arguably boosts the contrast and crispness a little. Returning to the f4.5 sample and heading into the far corner shows the detail remains pretty good with no obvious aberrations. Now these are JPEGs out of camera, so they'll already have had the correction profile applied. Stopping down to f5.6 again brings very mild improvements, but the V1's new lens is performing very well out of the gate. Close focusing is a treat on the V1 with a minimum distance of 5cm at the wide end or 15 when zoomed to the longer end. As you'll see in just a moment, this allows the V1 to fill its frame with objects measuring around 10cm wide, which is great when you're making video presentations of products. But how does the rendering in the background look? So here's my bokeh test, starting at the long end of the range at 50mm 4.5. Taking a closer look at the blobs in the background shows them to be mostly circular, but they do have quite visible outlines and textures within. Now to be fair, this isn't uncommon for a compact camera, and if you want cleaner, blobs or greater rendering, you'll need an interchangeable lens camera with a better lens. And here's how it looks at the wide end at 16mm 2.8, again mostly circular but with outlining and textures again. As you'll see in a moment though, it's still effective for subject separation when presenting products to camera, and I've also got some tests that show more portrait type distances. Before moving on to video though, here's a quick look at the focusing speed for photos. First at 16mm 2.8 from very close range, where you can see the V1 pulling focus very swiftly and without any troublesome overshooting. And now at 50mm 4.5, where again the focus pulls are swift and confident, lacking the hunting that often plagued the G7X series. This is thanks to the V1 now having dual pixel CMOS AF, a key upgrade especially for video, as you'll now see. Okay, so moving on to video, the PowerShot V1 can film 1080 from 24 to 120p, as well as 4K from 24 to 30p, all uncropped horizontally. 4K 50 and 60p are also available, albeit incurring a substantial 1.4 times crop and not supporting digital stabilization either. Autofocus is however available in all modes, and sound is also recorded in all of them too, apart from 1080 at 100 and 120p. Note that the latter is also selected from a separate high-speed video menu. Given sufficient power and no overheating, you can in theory record up to 6 hours per clip, but you're more likely to be cut short in practice. In my tests, I again managed 78 minutes of 4K 25p on a fully charged battery, and I hope to have some more results for you going forward. Meanwhile, graders will be pleased to find C-Log3 is available, while the built-in ND filter makes it easy to achieve motion-friendly shutter speeds. Here's how the video looks in practice, with the lens at 50mm, starting with 1080 at 25p, and now at 1080 and 50p, slowed by 2 times. And now for 1080 at 100p, slowed by 4 times. Again, this mode does not record audio, but they do all support autofocus. Now back to 1080 at 25p, before switching to 4K at 25p, which is oversampled from 5.7K for frame rates up to 30p. And finally for 4K at 50p, which incurs a 1.4 times crop, but at least it is including sound and it still works with autofocus. In terms of noise, here's how the V1's video looks in 4K 25p at 200 ISO, followed by 400 ISO, and you're looking at the full image here rather than zooming in. Next at 800 ISO, before switching to 1600 ISO. And now at 3200 ISO, followed by 6400 ISO, and finally at 12800, and that is the top standard sensitivity for video on the V1. Maybe I should have played music over those clips. Moving on to autofocus, here's a video test in 4K 25p with the lens at 50mm 4.5, and pulling focus between the bottle and the background pretty confidently. Again, notice there's no hunting here thanks to the dual pixel AF. You'll also get an idea of the amount of background blur that's possible, at least for close range subjects. And next at 16mm 2.8 from very close range, again proving the V1 can confidently pull focus without wobbling. It's also possible to adjust the refocusing speed and the responsiveness from the menus. Bottles are boring though, so how about yours truly, here at 50mm 4.5, showing the amount of background blur you can expect at a portrait distance. Sadly, not a huge amount of separation, but the coverage here does work well for tripod-based pieces to camera, and you can see the autofocus and face tracking effortlessly tracks me around the frame. And now for the wide end of the range at 16mm 2.8, where again there's not a huge amount of blurring possible in the background at this distance, and like all ultra-wide angles you're going to need to be careful to avoid distortion at close range. But what you can see here is how much of me is visible from a very close distance, waist up without stepping back too far. It's very practical for filming in different situations, and also makes it ideal for environmental portraits and presentations. And of course for handheld vlogging too, so now let's see how that looks with various stabilization and audio options. Okay, so let's start with the PowerShot V1, and I'm filming this in 4K at 25p. Recording audio with the built-in mics and with no stabilization enabled at all. Okay, so now I have enabled optical IS, that is lens-based stabilization only, no additional digital stabilization. I've got it set to the widest setting, that's 16mm equivalent and at f2.8. So this should give you an idea of the potential for shallow depth of field under these kind of conditions, under this sort of distance. Straight into the sun there. So I've now fitted the wind muffler that is supplied with the camera, and it can actually be pretty effective. It's not too big, just a little fluffy accessory that sits on the top and protects you from wind. But I am using one of the other really useful features in the camera, which is the built-in 3-stop ND filter, and this is allowing me to film with a shutter speed of 200th of a second at 100 ISO, so not ideal. Ideally, I'd really want that closer to 50th of a second, but under less stark conditions, it is quite easy to achieve that outdoors with that ND filter, and that is useful because there is no standard filter thread on the camera. Right, let's try some other settings. Right, for this clip, I have enabled digital stabilization. It is set to standard here, so you're looking at a combination of optical IS in the lens and digital stabilization. So because the lens started off so wide, it can actually accommodate quite a lot of digital stabilization, and there is an enhanced mode which is more severe, I'll warn you, so let's try it out. Right, so now I have the digital stabilization set to enhanced, and as before it's working alongside the optical IS in the lens. As you can see, it's taken quite a tighter crop on my face, but I think it's still wide enough for handheld vlogging at arm's length, and that is the benefit of a lens that starts at a 16mm equivalent. But I'm going to return to the normal stabilization mode and show you just one more audio option before moving on. Okay, for this final clip in the wooded area with the V1, I've switched my audio from the built-in mics, which is what we've been listening to so far, and I've now fitted a Rode Video Micro 2 to the accessory shoe and connected that to the 3.5mm mic input. Now, because it is a little bit breezy, I've attached Rode's optional wind muffler accessory, and you can see it at the top of the frame. So because this lens is so wide, you really do have to watch out for accessories like this, especially as on that particular microphone, it isn't very high above the shoe. Here's another microphone test, this time on a much more exposed scene. I'm on the beach. It's still not too windy, but you'd be surprised how much this mild breeze can ruin the audio in your recording. So I'm using the built-in microphones here with the fluffy wind muffler accessory mounted, and hopefully that is reducing that wind noise quite effectively. I'm also filming this at 16mm f2.8, so this is the widest coverage with the shallowest potential depth of field, and I have optical image stabilization and digital stabilization set to standard because the view is so wide at this focal length that I don't mind sacrificing a bit of coverage in return for that potentially superior stabilization. Or of course sometimes you're behind the camera. I'm about 30 centimeters or 1 foot away from the PowerShot V1, still recording with its built-in microphone with the anti-wind muffler accessory attached, so hopefully you can hear some of me and also some of the ambient sound of the sea lapping gently at the shore. This is Brighton Pier on a slightly misty day, so it's a little bit chilly and overcast, but it does mean with the built-in ND filter I've been able to achieve a motion-friendly shutter speed of a 50th of a second, at least with the aperture close to f8 here. I don't need a shallow depth of field, but it's really nice to be able to have that built-in ND filter. Here's the PowerShot V1 filming with optical stabilization alone and the built-in microphone with the wind muffler accessory. I've got it at its widest coverage, 16mm, 2.8 of course, and the ND filter under these slightly dim conditions is allowing me to film at a motion-friendly 50th of a second. Hooray! Okay, I've now moved indoors with the PowerShot V1 at 16mm 2.8. Look at this huge field of view. The camera is only about half a meter away from me here, and I'm using the built-in microphone to record the audio. Quite a lot of hard surfaces in here, so it might sound a little bit echoey, but if you've got softer surfaces, it should dampen those nicely. But the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to demonstrate the new close-up product presentation mode, which should concentrate on whatever you show to the camera. You don't need to put your hand in the way, you don't need to cover your face. It should allow my face to be in the frame and for you to focus on something closer. Let's start with a nice vintage Sony camera. This is a CyberShot T1. And I'm still in the frame, but it is now focusing on the camera. And this camera is only about 10 centimeters wide, and you can see just how good the close focusing is on this lens. It really will focus very, very close indeed. So this is a pretty small target, and I could be in the frame as well as the camera. How about something a little bit bigger? Here's a TV remote control. Again, my face in the frame. This is about 18 centimeters wide, so we can go a bit closer to it. How about some cosmetics? Here, this lipstick is about 7 centimeters long, and it is still, there we go, you can almost fill the frame with this. It is 7 centimeters long. The closest focusing distance from the front of the lens is about 5 centimeters away, so I was almost touching it at that point. Or perhaps if you're doing a sewing channel, here is some thread. Look how close that can be. And when you bring the product right up to the lens, you get that nice shallow depth of field effect. I've become quite blurry, put it out of the way. I come back again. Here it is, back and forth. So the PowerShot V1 with its dual pixel CMOS AF, its decent size sensor and close focusing distance and clever autofocusing software should put all of those old demons to rest from those older vlogging cameras. This is one where you can really show your products to the camera without any problems. And finally, it's time to hold on to your lunch as I shake the camera back and forth vigorously to see how the rolling shutter looks. First here in 1080 at 25p, where there's actually very little to complain about. And now in 1080 50p, where again there's virtually no visible rolling shutter artifacts. So far so good. Switching to 4K at 25p though, it shows more visible skewing as I shake the camera back and forth. This is most likely due to the slower full sensor readout that's used for the oversampled video in this mode, so as always you pay for improved detail with increased skewing. That said, it's not that bad if you're careful not to really throw the camera around. And finally in 4K at 50p from the same distance, hence the crop, and since this is effectively faster readout than 4K 25, there's also reduced skewing as a result. And now it's time for my verdict with more sample photos for you. See, it can be used as a photographer's camera. The PowerShot V1 is a long overdue new compact camera from Canon, coming almost 6 years after the G7X Mark III and G5X Mark II. During that time, we've seen demand initially decline for compacts, hence no new models from most companies, but then increase again to a point where today most have become back-ordered or resold at hugely inflated prices. So before even talking about how it performs or compares, the PowerShot V1 is simply a very welcome camera, so long as Canon makes enough of them to satisfy demand. It may be positioned and officially priced above the G7X Mark III, but ironically could end up costing less than scalpers are asking for that old model. But being no doubt the V1 is unashamedly aimed at video creators first, so there's no viewfinder, no flash, nor standard hot shoe either, and it's swapped the more standard zoom range of the G7X for one that starts much wider. This makes it less ideal for general photos, but perfect for handheld vlogging even with the crop from digital stabilization. Plus it also features a built-in cooling fan to maximise recording times, and a surprisingly good built-in microphone with an effective wind muffler in the box. The sensor being comfortably larger than the G7X series should also be a big upgrade, but it's important to note it's coupled with a dimmer aperture lens that negates some of the benefit for noise and depth of field when under the same conditions, but it should allow for greater dynamic range, plus there's now also C-Log to make the most of that. But arguably most importantly, that new sensor features dual pixel AF, which allows the V1 to refocus much more confidently than the G7X and G5X, banishing the wobbly focus pulls that plagued those models. So I'd say most video creators will prefer it over the G7X Mark III, and again it may end up being cheaper to buy too, but do compare it closely with the DJI Osmo Pocket 3, which can be great for handheld filming and also supports a neat wireless microphone system without the need for a separate receiver. And as a final word, while most companies are chasing the vlogging market, I would put in a word for the photographers out there who'd love a version of the V1 with a viewfinder and a flash rather than a cooling fan, and ideally a more general purpose lens too. And if that's not possible, an EVF accessory for the multifunction shoot would go a long way. So how about it, Canon? And that's it for this video. I've got lots more tests and comparisons which I hope to include in a follow-up if any of you are interested in seeing that. So do let me know what you think of the V1 and also what you'd like me to cover in a subsequent video. As always, thanks for watching, and thanks also to Wex for sponsoring this video. If you're in the UK and fancy trying out the V1 or getting yourself on their pre-order list for one sooner rather than later, check them out in the link in the description. See you next time. Bye bye.